Okay, Mayor Jones, you can begin.
Great. Good morning, and welcome to our Stimulus Advisory Board meeting. I am Mayor Tashara Jones. I use the she, her pronouns. And thank you all for joining us today. It's really such a privilege to be advised by a board of individuals as insightful, as distinguished, and as connected to the community and as diverse as this one. Thank you for your time and commitment to public service. I also want to thank St. Louisans for our huge response that we've seen to our call for public input. We've received over 2,400 survey responses, and I'm looking forward to hearing what we can learn from this feedback in the data and from the data and evaluation team shortly. As I explained a couple of weeks ago, while we recognize the singular opportunity to use the $500 million to fund bold investments designed to transform an unsustainable and intolerable status quo, my administration is currently focused on direct relief on meeting the critical needs of individuals, families, businesses, and neighborhoods across the city and getting those funds out quickly. While I originally planned to move direct relief appropriation through the Board of Aldermen before the budget, the reality is that that's folding in front. The reality in front of us is that the direct relief package will have to be folded into the budget, and it'll be the fastest way to deliver these funds to families in need. Frankly, it also gives us a little more time to process the Treasury guidance and ensure that our proposed uses are in line with the eligible uses. But though we have more time to finalize our framework, we cannot make additions to the budget until the Board of Aldermen sends it back to the Board of Estimate and Apportionment in mid-June. I want to be very clear with the people of St. Louis. Direct relief funds will be appropriated by July 1st when the new budget goes into effect. Some expenditures I'm looking to include are vaccinations, bringing vaccines to the people, mobile vaccination clinics, door knocking, education, good old canvassing door to door and signing people up to receive vaccines, rental assistance for anyone who's on the brink of because we're on the brink of an eviction crisis, city unemployment insurance. We just heard earlier this week that the state has decided not to continue funding the federal portion. So we want to try to replace a portion of those funds turned away by the state. Youth jobs and programming, we're coming up on summer. We want to make sure that every kid who wants a job can get a job, and that we have plenty of opportunities for our young people to thrive and grow and play and learn this summer. And much more, which is what you'll hear from the Direct Relief Working Group. And finally, before opening up the floor for introductions, I want to remind us all of this body's mandate: to conduct research, build processes, and provide recommendations designed to ensure that the American Rescue Plan funds are invested equitably, in line with the community's priorities, and for maximum transformational impact. To be clear, and I know you know this, but for the public, this is an advisory board, not a decision-making body. That said, process is policy, and this body will shape outcomes for the better for our city. And I'm grateful for your engagement, and I know, and please know, that we're just getting started. With that, again, I'm Tashara Jones. I use the she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm the mayor of the city of St. Louis, and I'll pass it off to Lisa Cagle, who will be facilitating today's meeting of the advisory board. Take it away, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Mayor Jones. Thank you for inviting us to be part of this advisory board at this historic moment in St. Louis history. Everyone, I'm Lisa Cagle. As Mayor Jones said, I am the Director of Innovative Services at Metro Transit under Bi-State Development, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. So here's what's up for today. We'll do a roll call first. Then we will also vote to approve the minutes from last week's, or the May 1st meeting. I did drop a link in the chat if people hadn't seen that for those minutes. Then we will do working group updates and an open discussion with question and answer period, and then follow up with next steps before we adjourn. So we encourage members of the public who are with us today to use the question and answer function of Zoom to ask your questions at any point during the meeting. but we'll have some time set aside after the working group updates to address those questions specifically. So we'll start with roll call. I do want to note that there are several members of the mayor's staff present today, including Jared Boyd, Nancy Cross, and Noel Pfeffer, who have been very involved in this process, and we thank them for their thoughtful engagement. And there are also several elected officials present today who have been engaged in this process and are here to receive the recommendations for this advisory board. When I don't call their names for a roll call for the staff or the elected officials, I want you to know why I didn't call their names. They are here to receive our recommendations as we have been mandated by this group. So I'll start with roll call. I want to change it up a bit. So we'll go alphabetically by first name this time, just to keep it interesting. All right. So first off, Amy Wehrmeyer.
Here.
Ari Oberson.
Here.
Blake Strode.
Here.
Brandon Comer. Brandon Comer. Chris Prunner.
Here.
Christina Garmendia.
Here.
Dara Eskridge.
Here.
David Dwight.
Here.
Ed Bryant. Did Ed join us yet? Ed Bryant? He may not have gotten in.
I believe Ed has a regular link as opposed to a panelist link, and they're trying to fix that right now.
Okay, so Ed may be present. They may not be able to speak yet, so we will follow up on that. Erica Henderson. Erica Henderson. Grace Kyung.
Here.
Jason Purnell.
Here.
Latanya Kenner. I see Latanya.
Here.
Okay. Lisa Cagle, I'm here. Mike Talboy. Mike Talboy. Molly Metzger.
Here.
Nyasha West. Nyasha West. Patrick Brown.
Here.
Paul Sorensen.
Here.
Rebecca Weaver.
Here.
Richard Von Glahn.
Here.
Rodney Boyd.
Here.
Sandra Moore.
Here.
Vanessa Foster Cooksey.
Here.
Wally Seward.
Here.
And then did we get Ed yet? Ed Bryant. Erica Henderson. Mike Talboy. All right, so maybe these folks will be able to join at some point. So, all right, thank you, everybody. So the next item on our agenda is actually, it's not on the agenda because we didn't put it on the public agenda, but we are going to do a approval of the minutes from the May 1st meeting, again, sent out by Noel to this advisory board on May 6th. So any discussion of the minutes? Are there any clarifications or anything that anybody wanted to add to those minutes? All right, do we have somebody who will move to approve those minutes?
Move to approve.
This is
the
Vanessa
minutes.
Cooksey, so moved.
Okay, Vanessa has moved. Wally, was that a second I heard from you?
I will second that. Yep.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 I am abstaining as I was at the meeting. Anyone who is opposed? All right, it sounds like we've approved our minutes. Thank you very much. The next item on our agenda is working group updates. So most of our meeting will be structured around the working group updates to frame further discussion and to be able to be accountable to the public about what's going on. So just as a reminder, these working groups were formed around objectives in the charge of the Stimulus Advisory Board to conduct research, build processes, and provide recommendations designed to ensure the American Rescue Plan funds are invested equitably in line with the community's priorities and for maximum transformational impact. The Stimulus Advisory Board will meet on a biweekly basis and work towards the following objectives: management and oversight, direct relief, process and planning, and we have added a data and evaluation group as well to help with this charge. So we're actually going to move the management and oversight up on the agenda today, as Rodney Boyd has several pressing items on his itinerary today, including walking his sister down the aisle for her wedding, which is exciting. So Rodney, we're going to turn it over to you first to give the updates, especially highlighting any kinds of recommendations or action items from the Management and Oversight Board.
Lisa, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. It is my sister's wedding day, and I also have the pleasure of co-hosting the Raw Vagabond Luncheon, so an exciting day today. The Management Oversight Committee is indeed excited to be a part of the advisory group. I want a couple of things at the outset as we get ready to frame the conversation. We're probably the most staff-heavy group of all of the advisory groups. And so with that, I want to sort of go through some of our recommendations. Mayor Jones has highlighted some of our what I'm going to talk about. In an effort to move the direct relief funds into the pipeline as fast as possible, we sort of are going to advise that we fold those funds into the budget and not a separate board bill. And so that way that will allow these funds to be available in early July. So they will go through the E&A and the traditional budgetary process and not a separate board bill. One of the other important things that's happened since our last meeting that we were anticipating is we have received Treasury Guidelines. So the extended time in the process with the budget bill will allow us to sort of follow the Treasury Guidelines, which we've been reading and learning, and it gives us just an opportunity to really sort of plow into some of the content, some of the objectives and things that Treasury has advised us that we need to do. One of the other important things that we're going to advise is an RFP process initially for an independent auditor. There is a current audit process that was used for the CARES Act. We have some advisory conversations around, do we extend that work? And we are advised taking a look at legal pathways to extend the CARES Act auditing work, also looking at another kind of independent auditor for the overall process. And so those are some of the things we're advising the broader group to take a look at, because we know it's important that we have objective eyes on these dollars and how these dollars are deployed, both in the direct relief fund and in the long-term funding process. Another very important sort of RFP advisory concept is we are looking to have an implement project manager, someone that their job will be to take the advice that we give to the elected officials, and when the elected officials accept and decide to act on it, someone that will be responsible for implementation. We felt that it would be very difficult to use the traditional office staff in the mayor's office for this role on top of all the other duties. So we're going to look to an RFP to create what we would call an implement project manager. That person, and the most important word to remember from that is implementation. The person will implement the directives of the mayor's office and the elected officials. They won't make rules. They'll be the implementation person. And that's something that we felt was very, very important. One of the other things that I'm advising, recommending with the agreement of our group is that our group, the Management Oversight Working Group, is so staff heavy that we should actually fold ourselves into primarily a staff working group. This is a group that needs to be comprised of decision makers. When we were first formed, we were looking at a world that was taking shape. That world is formed up much more substantively now. We know what we want to advise to do with funds. We kind of have a plan to move those funds through the budget. And now it's time for my group to give way to a decision-making group. So I'm going to recommend, with the support of my group, that our committee give way to really more of a staff-driven working group. Noel, if I missed anything, sort of jump in and help me out. But I think that's kind of the flow of what our working group wanted to bring to this meeting today.
I think you hit key points, Rodney, and thank you so much for the advice and insight throughout this startup process. The city will be convening an internal implementation team, and the essential idea will be that that team will provide an update at the top of future stimulus advisory board meetings. But one of the first tasks that we'll have is to take that direct relief framework, review it with the legal team to make sure that it meets the eligible uses, probably meet with Treasury to get the green light from them, and then move forward to create an implementation plan, in particular, issuing many of those RFPs that Rodney spoke about. But I think you hit the key points. If there's any other questions, we can open it up to the group.
I'm happy to try to answer any other questions.
Okay, it looks like Molly Metzger has her hand up.
Sorry about that. I had a question about folding the funds into the budget process. I think it makes a lot of sense. I did have just a specific question though, since there are multiple funds under Arpa. Of course, the biggest bucket is the state and local fiscal recovery fund. So I assume we're talking about that, the big, $500 million fund, but as well as the, smaller but still significant funds like ERAP. Are you also talking about folding that into the budget process?
Well, and I think the most important thing was that we were talking about initially running the direct relief funds, the $50 million into the budget process to start with, and then preserving more conversations and advisory from the staffing group that will form about how we move those other funds forward. I think that the most important thing that we developed was a plan. We advised the group, and it seemed to be accepted that we would take the $50 million and put it in direct relief access fund. And we found that the fastest way to get those funds in terms of an early July deployment into the community was to go through the budget process. With regards to other funds, we may be open to other ways to move those funds into, the staff may decide there's a better way in terms of working with the elected officials and the city council's office on how to actually do it. I guess my focus in this call was to talk about the $50 million direct relief amount being administered through the budget process for a more expeditious access to those in need.
And we will explore all avenues for appropriating the ERAP rental assistance funds. But I want to be clear that the budget and folding those into the budget as well is certainly an option.
Thanks for that question, Molly. Any follow-ups? Any other questions from the group regarding the report out from the current Oversight working group? Okay, I don't see anybody. Oh, Wally has his hand up.
Just a quick question. It makes total sense to me in terms of implementation that there is a group inside of the mayor's office, and that maybe what's happening currently with the management and oversight will flow to that. But I'm assuming there will still be a role for the advisory board to have oversight over implementation. So just want to make sure we're still holding space for that.
Absolutely. And one thing that we've been talking about as well is potentially the need to create a new working group. In the same way that we can pursuant to the recommendation of the working group and the mayor's authority to disband one, we may be able to create one as well. Most naturally, it seems that kind of management advisory role could fall to process. But for example, for a working group that may be necessary moving forward, once we've moved through direct relief, might be infrastructure, right? So there's a lot of possibilities moving forward, and look forward to hearing the thoughts and recommendations of this body.
And we did recommend keeping the option open, advising to keep the option open to form other groups as needed. It's just the function of this group has become so staff critical that we should give way to a group of decision makers at this point in terms of this specific management oversight committee.
All right, any other questions for this group? All right. We will move on to the next working group report out, and that is Data and Evaluation Working Group.
Okay, great. I'll get us started. My name is Christina Carmody. I'm a member of the Data and Evaluation Group. We're going into present mode. So we've put together a few slides just to walk us through the our report out, but we also will have a formal report sent to the whole committee or the whole board. And I think we'll work on getting that posted on the city website as well, so the public can read it as well. So next slide. We've done some follow-up analysis on the initial survey sent out to residents that had more of the open form responses, where Team TJ asked residents their priorities for the stimulus funds. And we just did a small analysis here, where a qualitative analysis looking at the target populations named by members of the community. So who should the stimulus benefit? And the number of mentions is then how many counts it appeared in throughout those close to 500 responses. So top groups are the unhoused, children and youth, small businesses, public transit users, families, North St. Louisans, and homeowners. And there's a lot of information in the responses community members gave in that initial survey that we'll continue to report out on to the different working groups and in these public meetings. So next slide, and that gave us kind of a taste of what was to come with the direct relief questionnaire that this committee put out. It was opened on May 4th, and it's still open. The survey is still open. You can still respond to it. But as of yesterday, was it yesterday? We had over 2,400 responses, and the survey was translated into several languages. Spanish, Arabic, Dari, Nepalese, and Kinyarwanda with the help of the International Institute. So thank you, Ari Obenson, for coordinating that effort. We are working on additional translations as well. And those translations are going to come in handy for future outreach as well. I wanted to note that this survey was a digital survey. So we always knew that there's going to be a bias towards younger, whiter, wealthier residents taking the survey. So they're going to be overrepresented in the survey results. We'll walk you through kind of who took the survey and how that compares to the city population. And then just some technicalities, for both race and gender questions. Counts include anyone who selected that identifier, and you're able to select multiple identifiers. And for income demographics, when we say lower income, it includes anyone who selected no to the question, is your household income greater than $44,000 per year? $44,000 per year is very close to our median income for the city. And then lastly, respondents were asked to score each direct relief option on a scale of 1 to 5, most important to not important. And those options for direct relief were prepared by the by the Direct Relief Committee. Just so that there's a clarity on that. And I'm going to give it over to Chris Brenner for the survey results.
Awesome, thanks, Christina. So I'll walk folks through sort of what the sample of respondents looked like, and then Paul will talk about the direct relief priority scores. In terms of where people came from, we had zip code data, just like we did with the first Google form that went out. So we figured we would start there. The vast majority of responses, about 78%, were people who both said they lived in the city of St. Louis and had a city of St. Louis zip code. There were a small number of people who said they lived in the city but gave a zip code elsewhere in the United States. After that, the next kind of big chunk of people live in the St. Louis metro area, but did not live in the city of St. Louis. And we had a very small number of respondents from outside of the St. Louis metro. Geographically within the city, the map looks very, very similar to the way it looked with the first Google form. So 63110, some of those South City zip codes and downtown zip codes had the highest response rates. We also asked people sort of more generally what their relationship to the city was. In addition to that, 79% of folks who said they lived in the city, about 44% said they worked or owned a business in the city. A very small number of people said that they go to school in the city. Like Christina said, we wanted to kind of characterize this group relative to the city's demographics. Predictably, because of the digital instruments, the sample is much wealthier than the city as a whole. So we picked $44,000 because that's the city of St. Louis's median income, or close to it. Almost 3/4 of the sample had an income that they reported to be over that number. So again, not surprising because of the way that this was collected. The sample is very much heavy in terms of people in that 30 to 49 age category. So these represent only the people who said they lived in the city of St. Louis, and these are per capita rates relative to those population numbers for the city. So we have the highest per capita response rates in the 30 to 39, 40 to 49 range. Very few respondents under 30 and very, very few respondents under 20. So few that I just lumped them together when we did this analysis. I think there were like 3 people maybe under the age of 20. And relatively few respondents over the age of 70. In terms of gender, we had a range of gender options, and that will likely change if we put out a different form. But the Census Bureau only reports data on sex, so male and female, which is why only those 2 categories are presented here. We have a higher response rate among women than men, who compared to the city demographics as a whole. For Latinos, they're slightly overrepresented relative to non-Latino respondents based on the city's demographic breakdowns. And then for race, folks who said that they did not fall into any of the census racial identity categories are the largest group per capita, followed by white respondents. The response rates for African-American and Asian residents in the city of St. Louis were the lowest. So with that, Paul, do you want to talk through some of the results?
Sure. So what did we find? So just to remind folks, if it's been a while since you've seen the survey or you did not take it yourself, the majority of what the survey asked was to have folks sort of name what was their top priority across these 8 categories, sort of their top priority, as well as sort of it was a Likert scale, essentially from 1 to 5, with pressing need to something that's not so pressing. And so what you see here is how those critical needs sort of compare to each other. I do think it's important to note that, you know, median scores were above average, were sort of 4 or 5 for all of the direct relief priorities. And so people thought they were all important. But even within that, there was some variation in terms of what folks ranked at the top in terms of their mean or average. So you see critical health needs rise to the top. Given the moment we're in with COVID and the variety of health needs that were both COVID related and otherwise sort of identified by local residents. And again, something that we've seen before is this need for housing assistance, whether it's rental, mortgage, utility assistance, or support for the unhoused. And those sort of really rising to the surface around the things that were important across the board. Although you'll also see here that folks thought many of these, if not all of these priorities, were important to consider moving forward. So I guess, yeah, so that's the kind of big takeaway from the survey, how those shook out. As part of our sort of racial equity charge, we also looked into whether or not there were differences from respondents based on their race or income identification. One thing that we found is that Black respondents ranked summer youth jobs of greater importance than other respondents. So that's definitely something to take into consideration. And I think what Christina and Chris mentioned before about survey bias and digital survey bias should be sort of pulled into this slide as well, in terms of, you know, this was just based on who we heard from, but who we heard from was also skewed in certain ways. Yeah, and Molly, I think that's a great point. The survey is still open. There is also some, you know, attempts and really sort of push to have this be a survey that is not just digital, and especially when we're talking about translation and reaching additional populations, making sure that folks folks were able to do that. So Jason, I saw a question about whether we should mention reverse coding. I want to throw that to Chris or Christina to mention whether or not there's anything to address there.
Yeah, I can just, I guess, say quickly. So I think when we set up the initial form, the values for the direct relief category support went from 1 to 5, but also included like a text label that was associated with each of those numbers. So from very important, which was associated with 1, to not important, which was associated with 5. When we prepared the report, which we can put a link to in the chat in just a second here, we reverse coded those to make the numbers more, a little more intuitive for folks, so that higher scores represented more emphasis on importance.
Great. So yeah, just something that, you know, those of you who see the report a little bit later wonder like, wait, was 1 here and 5 was here? We did some work to make sure it was clear as possible interpreting those findings. So the last thing we did was we also recognized that the survey itself, while very significant, was not the only source of information that was available to inform direct relief needs across the city over the course of the last year and through the pandemic. And so in partnership with United Way 211 and Mutual Aid, our team also analyzed over 82,000 requests for certain supports throughout St. Louis City over the course of the last year for additional insight into what was happening in the community. And so what you see here is the result of us taking the direct relief categories and crosswalking them with how 211 and Mutual Aid categorize their requests and sort of presented. What we're presenting here is really just sort of the aggregate number of those requests. There's also some analysis that we're beginning now around sort of zip codes, areas with the most requests, or sort of understanding sort of within 63115, how did these requests break down? But what we wanted to do here was present some initial findings for additional consideration. You know, rental mortgage utility assistance, wraparound support for the unhoused. Those are the things that were really rising to the surface. I think both with 211 and Mutual Aid, although due to the nature of what those services do, I think that also sort of makes sense why those placed higher, for instance, in things like summer youth programming. I did want to mention real quickly, Mutual Aid requests based on their model is somewhat of a combination of like cash assistance, rental assistance, and wraparound support for the unhoused. So we presented those numbers in aggregate, although we're doing a little bit of work diving into the detail there as well. And then finally, the CARES Act requests. And these were requests, not necessarily the folks who received assistance. That's another next step to understand these numbers. Those were just for rental and mortgage assistance. But still, we think this provided some pretty significant sort of counterweight to the survey as we consider where need is, where unmet need is, and where to really dive into the direct relief categories.
And just to note, along the way, we're going to be presenting and thinking about process learning. So this small survey that we ran this week is informing our recommendations to the administration as a whole. And like we mentioned before, you know, right off, we did choose a digital survey methodology in order to have quick turnaround on the results and to help inform the initial decision on what direct relief priorities should be recommended by the Direct Relief Committee. But knowing that there's downsides to using a digital approach, such as the bias we mentioned before. So for questions where it's really critical that we reach the focus populations, that we not just have a digital approach, but the text messaging system mentioned by Ari Obenson in the chat is going to be critical, as well as doing more door-to-door surveying. That does require additional resources, additional time. So it's always going to be a balance of the time that we have and the outreach that is needed to really inform decisions of this body. So I wanted to note that. And I also wanted to offer any of my other committee members to offer a process learning.
I think I just wanted to mention briefly sort of, there is additional outside data, both, from, 2-in-1, the United Way, and otherwise, that we do need to continue to sort of align. And one of the things I just sort of wanted to underscore is that that's important as we think about focusing investment, but it's also equally, if not more important, in implementation. When we talk about outreach, when we talk about prioritization, when we talk about evaluation. And so our, committee as a whole is sort of working on thinking through, how does the survey kind of dovetail with additional data sources, and how does that sort of create this continuous cycle of learning and evaluation, so we can do this as effectively and responsibly as we can.
All right.
Ed Bryant finally got the right link in the chat, so he's here, and he did mention he was lifting up something that Dar Eskridge had put forward at some earlier working group meetings about using the language of focus populations rather than target populations.
Noted.
Just because you're too nice to say it, Christina, I already heard you use it, so thank you.
Just wanted to lift it up in the chat, especially since we had the wrong link before, so thank you. And it looks like Sandy Moore has a question.
I don't have a question. I have an observation that even with the limited diverse access that we are acknowledging with a digital survey, the priorities seem to be holding up across those things that we all obviously know are having a deep adverse impact on distressed communities of color. So I just wanted to point that out, particularly when we're in a public conversation, that there seems to be clear unanimity that the priorities that we've identified here are the priorities that people need. And I don't want us to miss that.
Other questions or comments from the advisory board? It will remind anybody in the public to also drop any questions in the Q&A that we will address later. Wally has a comment or question.
Just a quick comment. I want to give a huge thank you to the data folks. I know you all have spending a ton of time on this, and it's all volunteer basis. Really appreciate what you've done here and that clear, cogent report you just gave out. Thank you.
Absolutely. I want to echo that. Yes, the slides are very helpful for looking at this large amount of data that you have already been working with. So thank you very much for that and making it clear as possible. Any other comments for this working group? Okay, seeing nobody raise their hands, it looks like we will move on to the direct relief working group.
Okay, I'm going to unmute, and I am here, and I'm going to share screen. Our slides aren't as pretty as the data group's slides, but we do have some. Let's share that. Okay. So I'll back up here. Again, good morning, Ed Bryant, United Way, Greater St. Louis. I'm also working with the data with the data group, not the data group, but the direct relief group, as well as the process and planning group. What I wanted to do is just basically remind folks of our mandate, so you can kind of get a sense of how we are looking to develop a framework for prioritizing the direct relief investments into the community. Our framework is conducting outreach to the marginalized communities and institutional stakeholders in order to assess the immediate needs of city residents. So again, highlight immediate needs, identify opportunities for impactful interventions. So highlight there is impactful interventions. There are so many interventions that we could take, but we're going to be really taking a high level look at what we believe are going to be the most impactful, and then recommend an actionable direct relief framework. And so how are we going to get the dollars from the city to the folks that need it? Here is a list of the folks that are on the work group. So you get a sense that of the amount of expertise from the community, our organizations, and how we can kind of lean into the work a lot of people are in this group that actually provide direct relief from their direct services from their organizations, as well as are really deep into the community and understanding what are the actual needs throughout our region.
Hey Ed, this is
Yes.
great. I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I think you're using out-of-date slides. If we can use the slides from Google when we were creating it online together.
These are the slides that I have that were based on that deck.
Yes, I made some changes this morning, but I am happy to chime in when we get to the
Okay, great. Yeah, please do.
final assistance. Thanks.
Yeah, please do. So just as you saw from the data team and the direct relief categories that we're really looking at are really based on some of the findings that we got from the data team, but also the recommendations that we made in terms of the high level categories of the allowable expenditures that we can spend from the American Rescue Plan dollars. The first obvious one is public health. So making sure that we transition and make that pivot from the helping our residents and neighbors not only get to vaccination sites, but actually maybe making that transition to mobile vaccinations, health clinics, and actually going out to the communities, doing some canvassing, supporting community health workers, getting vaccines to folks, as well as getting still needed PPE and information around the efficacy of those vaccines and those kinds of issues. So I think this is a unique opportunity for us now to make sure that we get more vaccines into bodies, as well as to deal with the community health issues that folks are having. The most obvious one is housing and utility assistance. This was obviously one of our highest rated findings from the data, but also this is something that we've been seeing from United Way, as well as in terms of the number of calls that we've been getting around rental and utility assistance. We already have around $12 billion of emergency rental and assistance programming funding that we can be utilizing, and then also transitioning to the affordable housing issues as well that we'll be looking at. Now, Molly, did you make some changes in this place? You might.
I did, and I just wanted to. It might be obvious, but I wanted to make clear that the ERAP funds, the majority of those funds will be spent on actual payments to tenants and landlords. So we hadn't listed that as an activity under rental and utility assistance, but that is the major use of that $12 million is actual direct payments to tenants and landlords.
Great.
If I may chime in here, just to note that the city is actually opening up a new round of rental assistance next week. This is not what we're talking about here, but it is important for the public to know that we will be opening up a new round of ERAP 1 rental assistance next week. But what we're talking about here is going to start after July 1st and involve a kind of expansion to the program involving a new set of partners, in particular the Housing Authority.
Looks like Paul also has a question here.
Well, I think that just brought up, and I know that there's been some discussion about this, but the ERAP dollars sort of versus the additional stimulus dollars, how is the Direct Relief Committee and the Mayor's office sort of looking at making sure they have different regulations around them and sort of different bounds. And so we should use the most flexible funds for the most flexible purpose and just really, focus the funds that are more limited accordingly. So how is that playing out? And if it's later in the conversation, I'm happy to take my conversation there.
Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Essentially, you hit the nail on the head, Paul, that the ARPA funds and the state and local fiscal relief funds in particular are much more flexible. And so we can use them to spend on canvassing and community outreach and on knocking doors and on funding case management. Because the problem right now, the way we're doing it, is that we're not funding case management at a high enough level for direct service agencies to bring on a full person whose full-time job is supporting folks through this process. But with the ARPA funds, we can expand that funding to the level where we can provide that scale, essentially. And same piece with legal assistance and mediation. The ARPA funds just allow us to go that extra mile that the ERAP funds won't allow for.
And just a note here as we're going forward, Molly has spelled out some of these acronyms for us. If you're interested, they are in the chat, but ERAP being emergency
assistance.
Yeah, go ahead, Ed, if you want to do that.
Yeah. Emergency rental and assistance.
And then SLFRF is State and Local Fiscal Relief Fund. And AHTF, it's harder to say the letters than it is to say the word sometimes, Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So just for clarity's sake, and DHS is the Department of Human Services. SLHA is St. Louis Housing Authority. And for anyone who is unclear, RFP is Request for Proposals.
Great. Questions here before your hand is up, Sandra. Do you have something you want to add?
No, I didn't have anything.
Okay, great. So again, one of the big categories or buckets is support for the unhoused, and so here again, the data that we received that we were able to analyze point to this as being a critical area of focus for us, and as Noel said, I think one of the things that's unique and it's more opportune about the ARPA Act funding is that there's a lot of flexibility here with the ARPA Act funding to be able to do some innovative things and work with partners that are already doing the work, such as Safe Haven and other organizations. But this is just a very high level list of some of the ideas that we're looking at in terms of making sure that our unhoused neighbors have opportunities to actually get secure housing. And then one of the areas that we've been talking a lot about in the region, even before the Stimulus Advisory Board began meeting, was this issue of digital divide. We saw this even in my own organization as we were reaching out and leaning into the community around regional response with the regional response team and other efforts, with the SLPS and their work and other school districts, where we were seeing these challenges with people having access to Wi-Fi that was able to handle the broadband needs and issues that our families and folks needed. When folks went to working virtual and kids were schooling from home, we saw these, and also we're even seeing these issues of reaching out and touching people as we try to get information and access and get these dollars out to the folks that need the dollars the most. So a couple of the key things that we're looking at are expanding access to devices. The St. Louis Public Library with the St. Louis Public Library partnership will help us there. We'll be able to get more devices into the hands of people to be able to lend devices to people who need them, and then expanding access to Wi-Fi or broadband by providing access points in city parks and community centers where we can actually have expand the broadband access to people can utilize those devices and continue to recover. Any questions or comments here?
Ed, I did have my hand up on this point since this was one of my specific assignments, and I just want everyone listening to understand that this is our fast response to make certain that people we do the best that we can. The mayor's guidance is to do the best that we can to get people connected right now. So, for example, expanding access to Wi-Fi. If you go down to Julia Davis Library on the north side of the city, or if you go, I think it's Carondelet on the south side of the city, they're putting up access points on the top of the library buildings, which will give more residents immediately the ability to have access that they don't have to pay for. They can click on, the library tells you what the code is, and you get access. So this is real time, getting you more opportunities with either a device or at your home with your phone or your tablet to be able to have a place to get. The rest of the story, however, is that this is something that we'll go into more infrastructure discussions as we go on down the line. And we look at this as something, and this is the mayor's guidance, that is really important to the entire city. We have our equity lens on all the time, but this is something that is important across the city. So I just wanted to add those two pieces in.
Great lift up. Any other comments, reactions?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things here. Wally in the chat asked if we create public access points, can any logon process include pointers to whatever public input the city is looking for at any time? So an interesting suggestion from Wally here.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm just going to go ahead and put this question from the question and answer because it's relevant here. Is it possible to ask churches and centers of faith to add Wi-Fi access points as well? Might be better added coverage.
Very good points.
Good point.
We will take, I will take them back to the work table.
Also, I think something we should probably consider when we begin to continue to discuss this is like, so there's several initiatives that other organizations like the Regional Chamber and us, as well as the another organization is doing some research to actually map out broadband access across the region that we may want to utilize, find out how that work is going on, since because to your point, Sandra, this is also an infrastructure play as well. And so it's something that not only have we recognized within our COVID-19 response efforts, but also other regional partners and regional organizations recognize this is an issue that can be a infrastructural systems change, ground changing approach for the whole region.
Absolutely, Ed. And we encourage anybody who is attending this call and knows about efforts that we may not know about. There are some outreach going on about this, but if you know about efforts, feel free to drop them in the question and answer so that we are coordinating as much as possible.
So if no other questions or comments, I'm going to move on to the next slide. I only have 2 more slides, I believe. And then one of the areas is youth jobs. And I think, youth jobs and programming, our kids are going to be moving into summer programming right now. And so there are additional efforts that we may want to pull into and lean into here around programs like the Gateway Go program that provides transportation for kids to get to their summer youth jobs. I know that the Regional Youth Employment Coalition is beginning to kind of ramp up their work in their summer youth jobs programming, and then doing recreational center and programming within creating learning labs. Basketball league is coming back or could come back, putting more social workers into the community. And then we're looking at partnering with the St. Louis public school system around programming that can actually not only start in the summer, but even move beyond the summer as we move into the new fall semester. Any other things here that from committee members that they might want to add?
Looks like Jason has his hand up.
Yeah, just a general comment that there may be points of intersection between some of these direct relief and one particular one. As we talk about youth, we're facing a behavioral health crisis for children and youth in our region. And so if there are ways to fold in behavioral health as we're offering programming for children and youth, I think that's something we should keep top of mind.
Good point. Good point. Any others?
Also a suggestion by someone from my staff at Metro, actually, of coordinating with some of these programmings like the youth job programmings, perhaps the Gateway Go programming, to make sure that there are resources available in public areas like public transit, for example, so to connect people with services so that people who may not be aware of it already get connected to services. So I just want to highlight that as a suggestion.
Yeah.
And it looks like Molly has her hand up.
Wanted to point out that also, there are so many different funding streams under Arpa. So SLPS is getting funding directly through Arpa.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously these are urgent needs. Our funds are going to be moving, in July, it looks like, but that doesn't mean that this need will not be met before then through other streams, like through SLPS.
Yep. Great. Any others?
This is Jared. I wanted to kind of amplify Molly's point, and I think it's perhaps worth providing a larger or a broader explanation for folks who don't follow this every day and who are at home and are not on the committee, in the sense of why outreach is such a prominent part of kind of funding for the direct relief, in the sense that all of the money that St. Louis is set to receive, the $500 million, really doesn't explain the full extent of stimulus funding that is available to St. Louis. There are buckets of money that people don't simply know about, and we actually have to go and meet them where they are to pull down those federal funds above and beyond the $500 million that we're set to receive. So, Molly, I think it would be worth kind of framing that a little bit more, But I would also say we've met with Dr. Adams at SLPS. There is a great working group of youth service providers that is meeting on a weekly basis that is trying to prepare for the summer and align our priorities with the school's priorities. But I would love for Molly just to kind of frame the opportunity beyond the $500 million that we have.
Not sure why you're putting me on the spot, Jared.
Sorry.
No, to be honest, I mean, I've been trying to wrap my head around all of these funding streams. It's really complicated. So I think, honestly, I would like to send it back to one of the working groups to really give us, to kind of step back a little bit, since we do have a little more time than we realized, to figure out, what's already, what's set in stone, what's not set in stone, so that we're better able to identify the gaps. So I'm not really ready to speak to it, to be honest, but I've been trying to wrap my head around it.
Well, and I think that what Jared is really kind of getting at is that in addition to the direct relief funds, there are also program dollars that are in the ARPA from different departments within the federal government, such as CBDG funds. I mean, there are different funding sources that you can actually apply for in those departments, in addition to the $517 million or the $2.8 billion that the state of Missouri is going to get. And so that's something that I think I agree. We need to kind of maybe take a look at that, because there could be more than just there is more than the 517 that we can get.
And an observation that I'd like to make about that, and we know on this Stimulus Advisory Board that we've all been thinking about it, but I think that at the beginning of the conversation today, it was highlighted from the management processing group that this is part of the thinking around getting an implementation team and implementation leader in place. So again, the mayor and her staff being very thoughtful around this one-time opportunity to pull all of these sources together and have implementation happen in an integrated way. So as Jared said, my offering here is for people who aren't thinking about this every single day, is that's why that piece that got talked about earlier by Rodney is so very important, so that all streams flow together and we maximize this opportunity for the benefit of the citizens, because at some point we won't have such a lucky flow of resources. But with this kind of approach, the goal is that we'll be so much better off, so much further down the road.
Absolutely.
Just a real quick, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Real quick tactical point. There's also an opportunity to have vaccine access in summer programs for youth now that we've got younger age.
Good point. That's a really good point.
We're doing pretty good on time here. So there's several comments in the chat and from the public that I'm just going to highlight here just so while we're on this, because it's all relevant to this specifically. So Sandy, thank you for that. I think that was very clarifying. So thank you for bringing out that. Christina Garmendia also had suggested it sounds like an opportunity for a new working group on intergovernmental coordination to keep us all updated. Several folks agreed with that. So that's a recommendation that I want to point out there. There is
Can I ask a clarifying question on that point? Is that for a working group within the Stimulus Advisory Board, or for a intergovernmental separate working group that also delivers updates to this body?
It sounds like a separate working group was what was recommended, but Christina, you can speak to that if you'd like.
Maybe yes, and yeah, I think there's members of the Stimulus Advisory Board that definitely have connections and can help keep us posted. Should the mayor's office or should the city of St. Louis also have something like that in place more permanently? Yes.
I agree with that, Christina. I think both answers.
Christina, and so are you specifically speaking of like within city departments or with the city with other units of government across the region?
Right. Yeah, I do think there should be someone whose role it is to work with those institutions permanently, if there isn't someone who has that job already in the mayor's office. But yeah, I think
okay.
Permanent and then temporary for specifically to the stimulus, and then more permanently.
So a couple of other things here. Lisa Potts has asked a couple questions. I did one of them relevant to the slides that are presented today at today's meeting. They will be available on the website. So any of the slides presented today's meeting will be available for the public. She also mentioned something about Wi-Fi that we'll come back to here in a minute. But to talk, there's a couple of different points about Jason's point about behavioral health crisis. One question from the public is, has there been consideration given to stand up mental health access points across the city that can connect people to resources long term? There's a little bit of reference to this, but if anybody wants to take that question.
I do. If we go back to the health slide, we do want to invest in expanding behavioral health resources, but still working out implementation details and welcome input.
And then also Grace in the chat mentions for behavioral health needs for youth, the health section is looking into options to support behavioral health needs. And it's a good reminder for us to tie the different relief sections together in our approaches. There is a question from Paul about how is the city also approaching coordination with the state, given assistance dollars flowing through the Missouri Housing Development Corporation and otherwise. This might go back to Christina's suggestion as well. And then a question from Molly to Dara, who said, Dara, you previously shared a very helpful overview of the various ARPA funding streams. If you have that handy, could you please share it again here as a link? And Dara just did that. So that is available in the chat to everyone, all panelists and attendees. Okay, I think that's all on the health. Just regarding Wi-Fi, Lisa Potts mentioned that there is a clergy advisory board that has churches representing all walks of faith, and they are in need of having Wi-Fi and broadband access. So maybe we could coordinate with them on that digital divide question. Back to you, Ed.
Okay. So this is my final slide. So this is the big area around economic relief. And so this is where we're looking at some innovative things that we're considering in our direct cash payments. As you know, this past week, the Missouri governor directed the Department of Labor to no longer receive the additional federal dollars of unemployment dollars of $300 a week that people were receiving on unemployment. So we have had some discussions about doing something here to help make the landing of folks softer. So we have more to really discuss there. Some targeted small business and nonprofit grants, as we know, during the pandemic, some of the businesses that were the most hurt were the small businesses, and specifically minority and women-owned businesses as well. And so we did discuss and have been looking at some providing a technical assistance hub for MWBEs, minority women-owned businesses. And then food security has also come up as well quite often. You saw that in the data as well. So we're looking at some community-driven food production and processing and distribution kind of supports. Anything else, team, that you might want to add here or discuss or talk about?
I think it's worth emphasizing that there are, as we've talked about, a lot of different ARPA funding streams, and in particular for small businesses, there are multiple opportunities, including a pretty enormous restaurant revitalization fund and other funds for small businesses. And so one of the piece of feedback we received from our meeting with the Accelerator for America Stimulus Command Center folks was that with the St. Louis, SLFRF, I always want to say St. Louis, but with the state and local fiscal relief funds, we may not need to allocate as large a portion of that to small businesses, although we still plan to allocate at least a small portion in a targeted manner.
Well, in relation to that, Noel, I think that the emphasis that Ed had up was on a sort of a technical assistance hub for minority and women-owned businesses relates to something that Rodney had said in last meeting, making sure that these need help. Question chat here from the public. In relation to small business assistance in neighborhoods of people of color, some loans should be non-collateralized. Some of our businesses don't have the ability to collateralize the loans due to discriminatory appraisal gaps. So I want to note that here as well.
Great.
Other questions before we talk about the next steps for the Direct Relief Committee? Okay, so Christina has asked, what are the next steps for the Direct Relief Committee? What are the next questions to answer? Are there any additional opportunities for community input specific to the direct relief dollars?
So I'll open it up here for our other work group members to really chime in here. Any thoughts on in terms of our next steps?
I think one of the areas that we obviously have a lot of ideas that we've presented to here, today across all these categories, and there's a lot of need, and we recognize that 50 million sounds like a lot of money, but when it comes down to the need, it's actually not a ton of money, and so we're going to have to focus. And I think one of the, getting the data from the data group has been very helpful, and I think the next step for us that we're looking at is can we take some of these priorities that we've outlined today, get another level of community engagement and feedback, perhaps through a public engagement process coming before us and being able to talk to us through maybe a public hearing of some sort, to get a little bit more feedback before we can make some final recommendations about around each one of these areas, while also finishing on our end all of the analysis that we need to do about all these different funding streams and money that's going into different governmental entities, to make sure that we really are targeting these resources into areas that are not getting funding through other governmental sources or other funding streams, to make sure that we really are putting the resources where it's going to matter the most. But I'm happy to have other committee members speak up in addition to that as well.
Thank you, Alderwoman Dr. Green. It's exciting to get to call you that. And thank you for your engagement in this process. Regarding community input, I know that the process and planning group will be talking a little bit more about that in the next report, but we have two hands up from other members. So I'm going to call on Ari first and then Christina.
Yeah, thank you. I think next steps for the Direct Relief Group is really beginning to have an engagement with local partners to determine what kind of initiatives are ongoing, which could provide answers to some of the questions that we raised in our groups, and also will highlight, it will facilitate the direct relief process, because at the end of the day, the goal should be providing direct relief, and that relief should be immediate. So working with existing programs would probably be the fastest and easiest way, and I think that should be a next step in our conversations as a working group.
Thank you, Ari. Christina, do you have something to add or something else to address? Oh, we might have to wait a minute for Christina's internet to come back. It looks like it might have dropped out for a second. So just while we're waiting on that, because I'm sure she has something we'd like to hear here. So thank you all for continuing to emphasize.
Yes, so I just wanted to.
There she is. Go back, Christina.
Go back? Okay. Sorry about that. Internet is unstable, which I bet everyone else, a lot of other people in the city are experiencing. The question, or I guess the follow-up comment I had, it sounds like we need, and I think the Direct Relief Group has already been starting to do this, the initiative mapping, the partners mapping, and the other question, if this first survey looked at what should we consider for direct relief, the next category is how, and how should that how should those direct relief priorities be delivered? So that's just I'm sure the process and planning group has thought about this too, but that was just one of my, I'm thinking ahead for the data and evaluation crew, like what's our next task?
Absolutely. And I was actually thanking you all for sort of keeping this, the framework front and center, not only for this group, but for the public about how and why we're doing things. The process and planning group I know has thought a lot about public input, and so they'll talk about that a little bit. But I really want to just highlight and thank all of these groups for the tremendous amount of work that you've already put into this thoughtful analysis, thoughtful about process, thoughtful about how to make sure that people's residents in the city are included as much as possible. This is a amazing amount of work for a volunteer group, and it's really encouraging to see the passion and commitment from residents of the city of St. Louis and those who are part of this region. So any other questions or comments for this direct relief group?
Hey, Lisa, this is Patrick.
Go ahead, Patrick.
I'm curious if Noel, maybe, have you considered the level of granularity that's going to be required for the $50 million expenditure being incorporated into the budget? Because that directly impacts how quickly we would need to finalize recommendations for you all to consider.
It's a good point, and we're using, initially when we were considering this as supplemental appropriation, we were using Board Bill 49 as a model, which has different categories ranging from a couple $1 million to a couple $100,000, each with kind of sentence descriptions of what that money is going to, and then the department that is authorized to allocate those funds or to issue an RFP. So that's about the level of granularity. Going through the budget, it's a little bit different. There can be certain categories, for example, the ERAP rental assistance funds, where we can really say $12 million for rental assistance and rental and utility. There will be other categories where we want to get a lot more granular. And that'll really be a question for the direct relief group and for the implementation city group, as to how much granularity is helpful and where we also want to leave a little bit of flexibility. Because an important point that I know Sandy has made is the need to leave some contingency funds in here for flexibility as new needs arise.
Okay, any other thoughts or questions in this direct relief group that has been so much of the focus of the initial part of this stimulus advisory board? Great, we can also have time for some other discussion after the report out. So keep those questions coming if you have them. All right, the next working group report out will be process and planning. And I think that Wally is giving that update.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm going to try to fly through this because we are coming up on time a little bit. But what I want to do is the mayor said something really important, which is process is policy. And this working group, or this stimulus advisory board, did what they were charged to do, was charged straight into the work, especially given this initial $50 million of direct aid. So the process and planning group has actually, now that first big push has been done, just wanted to take a step back and think about process internally and start with intentional process internally with ourselves as a stimulus advisory board. So we've got a few recommendations that I'm going to pass along in terms of how the stimulus advisory board and the working groups work as we move forward, just to make sure that we are modeling the best process ourselves. Before that, I wanted to make sure to reiterate one more thing for the public, especially again, which is one of the biggest things that the process and planning group is tasked with, is designing that community outreach process. And I want to be very, very clear that this initial highly impactful, very short survey was an initial foray out the door for this first 50 million of what's going to be $500 million plus of spending over the next 2 years. And that a big piece of what's going to be happening over the next few months is designing the full outreach process, which is going to involve digital, it's going to involve canvassing, it's going to involve paper, it's going to involve all the possible touch points we can with the community as we figure out this spending over the next couple of years. So just wanted to give people a sense, nobody thinks their community engagement job is done with a digital survey. That was a first out of the gate based on the priorities and the time crunch we were under. So I just want to be really clear about that. The next question, so I'm going to go through some of the recommendations that the process and planning group has for internal operations in the side of our groups, and then talk a little bit about what we can do next given some of the shifts based on the political landscape that have happened just in the last couple of days. So process recommendations for the full stimulus advisory board. That's all of us when we meet together on a bi-weekly basis. Number one, we'd like to recommend that the stimulus advisory board internally designate board co-chairs. And those co-chairs' role is to gather the agenda items and serve as main internal points of communications for the full stimulus advisory board. These chairs should not be city staff or a transition team. They should reflect inclusivity and diversity, and they should be a city resident. And I believe, Grace and Lisa, if you could put the link into the chat, we have created a form for folks that are on the Stimulus Advisory Board that meet these criteria to indicate their interest in the co-chair position. So if someone could place that in the chat for me, I would appreciate it. Second, we've been doing it, but we wanted to make sure that we do it openly and intentionally, which is that our decision-making processes, both in the working groups and the full stimulus advisory board, have been largely informal and consensus-based for decision-making. That has worked well to this point, and we want to continue to work that way. We just want to call out that that is our intentional plan. We would also like to make sure that both the full stimulus advisory board and each of the working groups install a backup plan for a general vote to be won by a majority in case of an inability to reach a consensus. And it would be the job of the co-chairs to decide when that consensus isn't being reached and a vote is called for. We also recommend that the Stimulus Advisory Board internally designate a facilitator for each meeting. As Lisa's been doing such an amazing job today, I think she's made a really good point for why that facilitator, separate from the co-chairs, whose job is only to make sure that the conversation is moving forward, is a really, really important piece of the puzzle. Thank you for your service today, Lisa. We just want to make sure we do that a little more formally moving forward. We want to recommend that every effort be made to seek clarity, and I think this is already happening, on the timeline of appropriations disbursements in terms of the process of spending these funds. And that includes some work in educating and capacity building among the public to understand these processes. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the context of some future community engagement recommendations that we have. Finally, we want to recommend, and I'm sure this is already happening, but we just wanted to put it on the table even more, that a communications strategy be developed ASAP to ensure that the public is aware of and understands the decision-making process, who the Stimulus Advisory Board is, how we fit into this process, how the political piece of the process is going to move forward, and our expectation of a robust public engagement process over the next few years. And also how that public input is integrated into the eventual decision-making on the allocation of funds. So those are some recommendations for internal next steps and processes for the full Stimulus Advisory Board. We also have some recommendations for each of the working groups, and it sounds like we may have some new working groups, so we should keep these in mind as we form those. Number one, again, maintain that current practice of consensus basis for decision-making, but in each of the working groups as well, install a plan for a general vote and the chairs. There should be a chair of each working group, similar along the lines of for the full stimulus advisory board, although I think a single chair for the working groups are fine, whereas we're recommending co-chairs for the stimulus advisory board. Their role would be the same. And we also want to make sure that there's communication happening between the working groups as well as possible. So if it's possible to designate some working group liaisons, there are several members of the Stimulus Advisory Board that are sitting in several different working groups. And I think a little bit more formally to make sure that there's someone's responsibility to make sure that when direct relief makes a decision that's going to affect data gathering, that's going to affect process, that information is being communicated from working group to working group as quickly as possible, simply by designating someone in those working groups to do that. And the final point is that we've already talked about kind of community partners, building that out. We're going to be working with a lot of folks in the community, and just want to let folks know that it is absolutely okay and welcome that if we need those community partners to be participating in the working group level, we can do this by inviting them as a special guest on a meeting by meeting basis. There isn't a problem with that, but that should be the process to bring those community partners in, invite them as special guests on a meeting by meeting basis. So those are some of the recommendations. I've also got that in a document that we will be forwarding to the full Stimulus Advisory Board so that you have all those to look through as each of the working groups kind of has their next meeting internally. The final point that we wanted to bring up from the Stimulus Advisory Board, and I don't have approved language from the process and planning just because this happened so fast. So anybody please jump in if I missed something. But that is the shift now from this initial $50 million being a supplemental appropriation, which meant bill was going to be basically have to be written this, starting this week moving forward. That coming through the budget means we have a little more time, which means we would very much like to get more community input and some different kinds of community input, some differently structured community input into this initial $50 million plus appropriation process. And one suggestion that has come out there is to take the next Stimulus Advisory Board meeting 2 weeks from today on May 29th and fully shift that into a community engagement meeting that could start with an update on the process and maybe a little bit of how does a bill become law? How does the budget flow from the Board of Aldermen to the Board of ENA and back, just to really give the public an opportunity to understand a little more of what the political process is that this advisory board is advising decisions about, and then ask each of the members of the Stimulus Advisory Board to introduce themselves very briefly so that the public can see who's on this advisory board, but spend most of that meeting, most of that 90 minutes with public testimony. And the goal, to align with things that have been being said earlier here in the meeting, the goal there is to get from the what to the how. Right? So let's hear from folks who have applied for some of those stimulus advisory or some of the prior housing funds. What worked, what didn't, what are the needs, to get a little more into the details of how based on that public testimony. So that's another recommendation we have to the Stimulus Advisory Board to think about moving forward. And I think, and we asked questions about next steps for data and next steps for direct relief. I think for both of those working groups, data, how do we record and code and pull what we need from that public testimony that we're going to hear? Direct relief, how do we structure and do reach out and pose questions for that public testimony? I think are some of those next steps and things to think about. And I will stop there and ask anybody else from the Process and Planning Committee to weigh in on anything that I have missed.
Thank you, Wally. So yeah, one of the things that Wally represented here is that moving forward for working group updates, we really think that working groups should emphasize and make very clear what their recommendations are that the full Stimulus Advisory Board will consider as recommendations to the mayor and her staff. That's something really important. We want to make clear what the recommendations are. Christina Garmendi had asked in the comments, how long is the co-chair term and does the SAB have an end date? So that's something that we will need to clarify. I think that's really important. Thank you, Christina. And then there was also just Rebecca reiterating that the process and planning group is recommending both designating co-chairs for the Stimulus Advisory Group and chairs for each working group, just to make sure that there's consistency and communication between groups. And it looks like Christina has her hand up.
Yes, so related to the last recommendation for the data and evaluation group to code the qualitative input that we're receiving, I did want to note that we'll need additional capacity to do that. It is very time consuming to read and code. And for that target population analysis I did, that I just did it by myself, and recommended practice is at least 2 readers. So just to, I'm happy to pursue that recommendation. We'll probably want to bring in some additional readers. And I've had a few people reach out to me to volunteer. So I didn't know if there was any feedback from the rest of the group, whether that would be all right for us to bring in volunteer readers to read the survey responses.
You're getting a thumbs up here from Wally.
Okay.
I would echo that, and I also believe there are discussions in the works to get additional data and analytical support from some of our region's wonderful universities.
Okay, so we are coming up on time. It is 11:30. There was some questions specifically about the direct relief group and when is a recommendation officially being made to the mayor about this. There were several questions about timeline. That's something that the process and planning group has been working on and will update this week. We need to get a process that's easy to get all the working groups to get their decision points in there so we can address some of those questions in a coordinated fashion so that we're not all just doing this separately. There have been no other questions from the public except for somebody asking if they can send snacks to us, because how many hours a week are we having to spend on this, which we appreciate that. And, you know, if you want to send us snacks, we would not say no to that. Wally has his hand up again.
I'm not sure if it's popping up for you, but there is a separate question from a T. Irons in relation to small business assistance in neighborhoods of people of color. Some loans should be non-collateralized. Some of our businesses don't have the ability to collateralize the loans due to discriminatory appraisal gaps. So just wanted to lift that up.
Thanks, Wally. And I also want to also amplify the question about the timeline of when the direct relief framework will be proposed, because I actually think that's a really critical question. And I would ask process, do you think it's important to have that framework available before the public hearing, right? So that the public has something to react to and provide feedback on, or after, so that it is built in light of those recommendations?
That's a question for us to consider. Wally has some initial thoughts about it.
I think we should probably think about it and
we should, but I think there's an easy, which is that we use the big buckets that we already have as a framework to inform the questions that are answered, or the testimony that we're going to bring to that public input, to dive a little more deeper. What does it mean to put money into housing? What are those specific issues? What does it mean to put money into youth behavioral health? Can we just drill down a little more on what those specifics look like? I think that's what the public testimony would be useful for. What's the experience from their end to guide how that money is spent in each of those buckets, if that makes sense.
Okay, and Sandy, you have your hand up. On mute.
With regard to Citizen Irons' comment, I just want to make certain that the public knows we've not talked about any loan program as part of the stimulus. We've only talked about small business granting. So that point is very well taken, and we'll keep it under advisement, but I just didn't want anyone thinking that we've even contemplated any loans for this direct relief.
Great. Okay, in the interest of time, are there any other pressing things or recommendations that we want to make sure are lifted up that we're not super clear that it was a recommendation that we made at this point? That as a recommendation, again, from the process and planning group, that it's very clear in the future what recommendations are being made by the different working groups for this stimulus advisory board to consider as a recommendation for the mayor and her staff. Christina, go ahead.
Last comment is related to it. There was a question whether we were missing anything from the direct relief options that were presented. And I think it might be helpful for us for the next meeting for what do the federal Treasury guidance name any potential uses that we haven't talked about yet? And from data and evaluation also looked at responses from mutual aid and 211, like were there any categories of aid that people were requesting that aren't covered in our frameworks thus far? So those are kind of the two inputs that might inform, should we be adding additional categories?
Great, thank you.
Just to add to Christina's point really quickly, as soon as folks on other committees begin to identify things that maybe something's considered beyond the initial 50 million, the sooner the better, so we can start to align additional data as well as code, community engagement responses, et cetera, because it does take us a second to ramp up, to Christina's point. And we don't want to miss, coding something while we're going through the deep dive with volunteers or otherwise.
Thank you, Paul. So yes, I think that some really pressing next steps have to do with timeline. So we'll work on that this week. The process and planning group had some suggestions, but we had not formulated it into a specific recommendation yet. I think that will be really helpful. And then considering when this public hearing will happen, we will have another stimulus advisory board meeting on May 29th. That's following our bi-weekly schedule. The agenda will be determined ahead of then, and hopefully we'll get input from everybody about what else should be included. I think that that's it today, though. There has been a lot of focus specifically internally on thinking about the structures of this group. I think we're doing a good job with that and ready to move on from these sort of urgent first priorities. Continue looking at direct relief, but also looking at some of these more long-term things as well. So really appreciate everybody's thoughtful feedback on that. And if we have nothing else, I think that we are ready to adjourn. Jared, do you have any final comments?
Just want to thank everyone again for this largely volunteer effort. I think, we can't thank you all enough for rallying around this time of need. So thank you all again for your participation, and for those who are not formally on the advisory board for following this and asking wonderful questions as well.
And I did want to note one more thing, that it looked like besides Alderwoman Dr. Green, that also State Representative Kimberly Ann Collins was on the call today. So we appreciate her input as well. So, all right, thank you everybody, and have a good weekend.
Thank you.